Welcome to Lynn Cullen Live. Talk radio without the static. Email your questions and comments to lynncullenshow@gmail.com. And now your host, Lynn Cullen.
Hey there. Let me be the first, perhaps, to welcome you to January 13th, 2022. I hope it will be a good day for us all. You have the opportunity for at least the next hour to learn something about yourself, about us. My guest is a writer specializing in science writing and cultural writing. Her work you have read perhaps in the Atlantic, in the New York Times, and the New Republic, so she's no slouch when it comes to writing about science, about translating it to the rest of us. And her book, which we want to talk about today, is called The End of Bias. It is my pleasure to welcome Jessica Nordell. Hi, Jessica.
Hi. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm going to send your words right back to you now. You say we learn biases and we can unlearn biases, but, and it's that but that I get stuck on. You went right through it because you wrote the book, but you say bias is deeply ingrained and it is resistant to change, and it is constantly reinforced and bolstered by the cultural messages that we are getting, in your words, 24/7 in surround sound.
Mm-hmm.
So this sounds like a pretty daunting task.
Yes. Yes. I mean, if we had solved the problem already, if it was easy, we would have solved it already.
But isn't bias just part and parcel of being human?
Yes. I mean, in some ways, yes. I mean, fundamentally, bias is a function of our human need to categorize. We see the world. We can't just deal with, undifferentiated bits of information flying into our brains. We need to make some sense of it and categorize it. And then, what we do with those categories is there are all sorts of downstream things, like we overemphasize the similarities among members of a category. We underestimate the differences among members of a category. So the sort of human tendency to categorize is universal, and like you said, it's just part of the human experience. But then the stereotypes that we associate with those categories are really often human invention, it's a cultural byproduct. And that's where the harm comes in, because those stereotypes are often wrong. They're often harmful lies. And so that's, I think, why we have to be so vigilant about, being aware of what we're doing once we categorize one another.
Well, when you say that you bring in human invention, that we create these, I just want to say that reading your book, I mean, it is, there are so many times that I just, found myself sighing because of what we humans do. And, when it comes to bias, it seems to me that we Americans, in many ways, wrote the book of the negative aspects of categorization. Because when it comes to race, man, we are at the forefront of that garbage. And I mean, it's a fact, is it not, that the Nazis, when they were trying to figure out how to do what they were going to do, they looked to America and to Jim Crow laws.
They did. Yeah. I mean, that was one of the really just sort of startling pieces of research that I came across when I was, working on this project. Seeing, actual German transcripts among high-ranking members of the Nazi Party saying things like, if only the, American Jim Crow laws included Jews, it would be perfect for us. It would work perfectly for us. So yeah, they did. I mean, we know that the Nazis looked at American race laws as an inspiration, for their extermination of the Jews.
So you go into the book about the what is the idea of race, because let's be clear, it is not a scientific categorization, is it?
Correct. No, it's an invention. It's not that old either. I mean, that's
what I want to talk about. Jessica, that's what I want to talk about. You don't have to go far back to find out where this idea of categorization by race begins. In most of human history, it didn't exist. So can you give us a short course in where?
Yeah, really. No, it's really interesting. I mean, if you go back to, one of the questions that I had when I was working on this was like, where does racism come from? Where does sexism come from? Like, who was the first person to have this idea that, you can organize people by the color of their skin and put them into some sort of hierarchy on the basis of that. And yeah, I mean, as you say, it hasn't been around for that long. If you go back to, if you go back to really early times, if you go back to ancient Egypt, for instance, we see no evidence of skin color prejudice. And in fact, there's a tomb excavation that shows that there was a Nubian man from what is now southern Sudan who was in the highest ranking of Egyptian, the Egyptian political order. He was buried in the Valley of the Kings alongside the most powerful rulers of the day with enormous riches in his tomb. And there's no evidence that there was, skin color prejudice. Nubians were able to integrate into the highest ranking, highest levels of Egyptian society. And, you see other ancient cultures where you also don't see this skin color prejudice. So it wasn't really until the 15th century that the idea of people from the African continent all belonging to one group that had something in common really came about. And then the idea of race sort of developed over the 1600s, 1700s. There were a bunch of different sort of European philosophers who had different ideas about how you could organize people. Some of them thought the world was made up of like 3 groups of people. Others said, no, there are 5 groups. They're constantly sort of debating like how many groups of people there are and how you organize people. But yeah, I mean, and the idea of the white race really came about as a consequence of the slave trade. It was a way to distinguish, those who would be subject to chattel slavery from those who wouldn't. So you see, like in America, it's really not until the end of the 1600s that that Europeans living in present, what this continent were described as white. It's not that old. This is like a new idea, really, in terms of human history.
It really is. It really is, and it comes out of the need to, I guess, explain away slavery, doesn't it, or make it more palatable. The alarming thing is that the scientific community, while this is happening, goes right along with it. Does it not? I mean, the science absolutely agreed about the mental superiority of the so-called white race.
Yes.
I think you say at one point in the book, well into the 20th century.
Yeah, I mean, in the early 20th century, you see, psychology, papers published in, academic psychology journals, sort of quote unquote proving, the differences between different races, capacities. You see, Army tests, tests being administered to Army soldiers to look at kind of like differences. And actually, interestingly, one of the reasons that the psychology community kind of did an about face in the like 1920s, 30s, 40s was that there were these tests that were given to soldiers, and they found that actually Black soldiers in the North performed better on the test than white soldiers from the South. And
I'm sorry.
and so that was one of that was one of the there were a number of different factors, but that was one of the reasons that the psychology community started to, this sort of idea that they had taken just as sort of, true on its face started to crumble. And that's when you start to see psychologists shift from trying to prove a racial hierarchy to actually trying to question prejudice.
That's amazing, though, that you're talking about, in the lifetime of my mother, given that she's almost 100. But yes. So
exactly.
So this is how raw all of this effort to unlearn this insanity.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like a collective delusion. It's almost like it's a hallucination. And I think, one of the things that's so challenging about race and racism is that it is both a fiction that was created by humans for political and economic reasons.
Yeah.
And it's, made up. And at the same time, it is the organizing principle of so much of our country. So it's like fictional, but also incredibly,
real.
Pervasive, influential, real. So I think, one of the things that I think is so challenging about tackling it is holding both of those in our minds at the same time.
Well, I'm going to share a quote that you use from the genius James Baldwin. And he said this: whites are trapped in a history they don't understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it.
Yes.
Wow. But the reluctance to understand it in this country is just astonishing to me. And it's what, so many of us are seeing. So right in our faces, given the political climate we are now unhappily existing in.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, it makes your whole hopeful effort here to show a pathway out of this insanity. It makes it look like a pretty impossible slog. I'm sorry.
I understand. I mean, I feel hope because I have seen change. My whole purpose in doing this project was really to try to answer the question: what causes people to change? How does change happen? How do people start to become less discriminatory? How do people act less biased toward one another? And what actually works? And what gave me hope, and what I hope gives, readers and your listeners hope, is that there are approaches that have actually changed people, that have actually improved the way people treat one another, so that, we can start to move into, in a better direction collectively. But I mean, I agree with you. There are a lot of headwinds, but,
Yeah. And I have to tell you, well, I'll try. Okay, I will. I'm going to say this. But so when you talk in your book about maybe a program, some kind of policy that is instituted in a school or some other, or in a company setting, And it shows that it works. I mean, my gosh, this actually works to make people move to a better place, learn about themselves, and then you read later, and you're telling us about this, that program has been discontinued.
Mm-hmm.
These things don't get sustained.
Right. Which is why, I mean, I think this challenge, it's like, people often ask me, well, okay, so what do we do? Like, what are 3 things that, we can do in my organization or in my school, et cetera? And I think, I think that the trick here is that there are these programs and approaches that work, but they're really only as strong as the commitment, as the commitment.
That's right. Right.
Of the leadership, of the people who actually control the resources. And that's why I see this as both a practical problem and kind of a spiritual problem. It takes all of these different approaches. We need these kind of technical interventions that have been found to work, but we also need to really ask ourselves, like, who are we as people, and how do we want to show up to one another? And that's a spiritual question. That's not a technical question.
You point out, I want to drop back and talk about the pervasiveness, because of our culture, the pervasiveness of wrong messaging on race and sex and all the other stuff, where we see how the dominant group maintains their dominance. There was a fascinating little piece, at least to me, in your book, about this town in Canada. This is 1973, guys. 1973. There's this little town, I don't know how big it is. There's a town in Canada that for some reason cannot get television reception, right? And then eventually they do. Somehow TV comes in. So people who like to study the impact of what has television done to us, to our feelings about each other, were able to take, this was a study, I mean, there's a whole town that had never been subjected to television, to the messages. And so people scientists came in to look at what their attitudes were before the TV came and then after the TV came. And what did it show? Not anything.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
What? People who had, it taught our television, what we see every day, our television taught those people to be worse humans.
Yeah, I mean, people in this town became more elderly people became more isolated. There were fewer sporting events. Children became more aggressive. I mean, it was really alarming, how the town really changed. And then children they started stereotyping men and women more. That was one of the main findings that the researchers uncovered, that children, after the introduction of television, started.
Children knew that a woman shouldn't be a doctor. Children knew that women were supposed to do. And this is so ingrained in all of us. You say stereotypes don't just lounge around in our minds. Our brains put them to work at every opportunity. So, what works? We do diversity training now. My gosh, anybody who works for a major corporation has probably been through diversity training. It's a multi-billion-dollar a year business in this country. Does it work?
Yeah. So diversity training is kind of interesting. I mean, it's a kind of a complicated answer. I can't say absolutely yes, absolutely no. The challenge with diversity training is that it's usually not evaluated. So we don't often actually know whether it works or not. And when we say, does it work? I mean, another challenge is that it's often not introduced with like a specific goal in mind. So it's hard to evaluate it at all because we don't actually know what we're looking for. It's often, used for sort of liability reasons, honestly, like for, so that a company can say, oh yeah, we did our diversity training, we check that box.
Right, exactly.
That said, like there are some trainings that have been shown to change people. I mean, I'll put as an aside, another challenge of these trainings is that people are coming to them from such completely different backgrounds, but they're given kind of as a one size fits all. So you might have someone who's like a complete skeptic who doesn't believe that there are any problems and that, in fact, maybe it's a member of a historically privileged group and a person, maybe that person feels that they actually are suffering from discrimination. And then you have people who are, themselves on the receiving end of an enormous amount of discrimination, and they're all kind of put in a room together and given the same training. So that's another challenge. But there are, some approaches that have been found to work. There's a particular approach that includes increasing people's awareness of bias, increasing people's awareness of their own ability to behave in biased ways, and increasing their understanding of how detrimental it can be to others, and then giving them additional strategies to use, like trying to take another person's perspective or looking at situational reasons why a person might be behaving in the way that they do. And that approach has been shown to change people's behavior. There are other approaches, and then there are, often diversity training is sort of wrapped in with other initiatives like actually active mentorship and sponsorship, which works. That actually has been shown to increase the number of women and people from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups in management positions. So it's sort of a complicated answer, but the answer is like yes and no, I guess.
Well, I mean, I would imagine that an awful lot of diversity training is exactly what you suggest. It's to, to check off, that for litigious reasons. But it's clear that, obviously something so ingrained is not going to be changed by a few hours of some, I don't know, generally diversity training. How long does that last? How many hours is that for a person? And the reality is so often white people's reaction to obvious racism is defensiveness. You point that out really beautifully when you zero in on police. Because obviously police, with their incredible power to literally take someone's life away in a split second, if they have these biases in their heads, and why wouldn't they? They're humans. They are the people more than any that should be on the receiving end of diversity training that works. It would literally save lives. You point out that a number of studies show that police departments are just filled with cops who have depression, PTSD, suicidal thoughts. You quote one police officer as saying the culture is a toxic drip of hostility, intimidation, denial of suffering, and intolerance of emotions.
Yeah, isn't that powerful? That's from, I mean, a number of officers who I spoke with talked about how they're broken. They are they are often completely broken down by the work, by the dehumanization of others and self that is involved in doing policing, in American style policing, and it's really detrimental to the community. Obviously, as we've seen
yes.
so clearly, and yeah, I mean that's why in that chapter that you're referring to, one of the things that I was looking at was whether changing the kind of inner life of a police officer can have a downstream effect on the way they interact with the community.
And you talk about one instance, I believe it was in LA, right, where a so-called jigsaw program really worked, where the police, a specific group of cops were told, stop doing whatever it is you've always been doing and just get to know. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm simplifying. But wow, a lot of wonderful things happened.
Yeah, it was a really remarkable program. It's actually still going on. It's a small, it started as a very small program just in 3 or 4 housing developments in Watts, in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles. And yeah, essentially, the community was facing an ongoing crisis of violence, mistrust, police, both community violence and police violence, high rates of arrest, many problems. And this civil rights attorney named Connie Rice, who's a longtime litigator, she for decades actually sued the police for discrimination. She ended up, along with some other people and some other organizations, crafting this initiative. And yeah, as you say, it was really designed to bring officers and community members together in a way that would increase trust, increase respect, increase mutual understanding. And the result was, there were a lot of different sort of moving parts to the program, but long story short, the result was that when it was evaluated, they found that arrests had gone down this cohort. Arrests went down, crime went down, violent crime went down, and there were more respectful relationships between the police and the community. The community actually felt the police respect us, they value us, they're treating us the way that we deserve to be treated.
Well, that takes some pretty special cops, I would think. So did people volunteer to do this? Because I can't imagine, there's some cops that are just so resistant to anything.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It was interesting. I think when the program was piloted, they had about 400 people apply for 40 slots, and they were handpicked. So they were handpicked, and the criteria that they were picked on the basis of were things like, did they seem open to new ways of policing? Did they have a connection to this community? Were they bilingual? There are many Spanish-speaking community members, so they were looking for people who were bilingual, and people who seemed, open. Because as you say, not everybody is going to be open to a completely different approach. I mean, these officers were told your goal is no longer arresting people. Your goal is forming relationships with people. So that's a completely, totally 180 from the traditional incentive structure.
Well, there's a point that this is one little vignette when this program's been going on for some time, where there was I think it was a baseball game going on with members of the community, the kids, and some cops, and a boy from the neighborhood comes walking onto the field, and it looks like he's carrying a gun.
Mm-hmm.
And not one of the cops like went racing for their guns or anything. They had time, they knew, and it was a toy gun, right? It was a toy gun. But these police did not act with the immediacy of the cop who killed Tamir Rice, for instance.
Correct.
That little boy with a gun is dead.
Right.
Toy gun. Yeah.
Yeah, in this case, it was really, yeah. I mean, the officer, they knew the children, they had relationships with them, so they didn't expect, they didn't sort of jump to the kind of conclusion that the child was intending anything harmful. And it turned out to be a toy gun. Thank goodness, thank goodness no one did anything, out of fear, because it could have been another crisis.
So when you tell us about these things that are working and police like willing to do this mindfulness training and, the kind of stuff that you can't imagine would work in that aggressive kind of a culture. Mm-hmm. It's just good to know that there are individuals within it that do want to change things, but they seem to be in a minority.
It's tough. You definitely have people who are open to new ways of doing things, but then you have so many structural barriers to change, like, the iron grip of the police union, qualified immunity. It's I live in Minneapolis. It's very difficult to fire police officers here. Yeah. The union is incredibly strong. And so there are sort of these competing forces that make it very difficult. But what I was really hoping to do was to shine a light on approaches, programs, interventions, people, that are working successfully to make positive change in the pockets, with the hope that can encourage, and empower other people to see those successes and then amplify them in their own communities.
Well, not too many years ago, Pittsburgh hired a very progressive chief of police. And I remember thinking, he came out of Madison, Wisconsin, where I know you have spent time, as have I. I knew the chief that he had mentored him, David Cooper. And I thought, this poor guy is going to be eaten alive. And he was. He was gone within a year. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we thank the police union. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, obviously, you can't legislate away this stuff. You just can't. It's culture. It's the structures of the culture. And this is where the change must start. I mean, when you look at the structure, look at even the internet, look at the algorithms, look at the software that now informs our lives. And software, you point out, always exhibits the essential features of the group that built it. Well, who built all of that? White men and a few Asians, right? White men. So all of that, what? It's all of that, the internet that we spend all our time with, it's just suffused with this assumption that white men are the template. I mean, if a woman goes to a hospital with a heart attack, she often, is not treated for a heart attack because it is said that women present with atypical symptoms. You know what that means? They present unlike men.
Right.
And medicine has been outrageous in failing, in assuming, making the assumption or whatever, just the default is normal is white male. And a lot of us think
it's the reason. Yeah, I mean, it's the reason that if we're going to solve these problems, we need a huge amount of diversity at all levels of, the creation of everything, the creation of pharmaceuticals, the creation of software, the creation of algorithms, because otherwise there's just too many blind spots. Like we need, a huge array of perspectives so that we don't make these kinds of problems, don't make these kinds of errors.
Let's be clear, as these white men are creating these structures, they're not thinking consciously about, keeping Black people or women or any other marginalized group, making things hard for them, because they're just operating under their sense of the world, their experience of the world. And that creates a lot of trouble when they're the ones creating the structures, because their experience of the world is not the experience of I would say, the vast majority of humans.
Yeah, I mean, one of the illustrations of this is, in the creation of Twitter, which was created by a pretty homogenous group of software engineers who really did not anticipate the way that Twitter could be used as a way to hurl abuse and amplify abuse. And the reason that they didn't anticipate that was that they themselves had not had the experience of being abused online. Right. So It's not, I mean, I don't mean to demonize an entire category of people. In my book, I'm really careful to not demonize like the group of white men. But I think what's important is that if a group of people are tasked with creating something as fundamental as social media, it's a real problem if they are only drawing from one set of experiences, because they're not going to anticipate the kinds of impact that people from other groups are going to have. And we see that, across social media right now, because so much of social media was created by people who had not themselves had the experience of being abused and harassed online themselves.
That's correct. We have a listener who has sent a question and comment by email. And let me read it. How are we supposed to get through to others and not just keep preaching to the choir without being accused of teaching critical race theory? Do you actually see any headway being made? And then he says, I work for an international company whose website promotes diversity and offers online classes, but nobody takes the classes. And I hear that are all white male managers and others making racist, sexist, and xenophobic comments. Our girls, and he's got that in, all work in administration. We have no minorities in our office. I don't think my company is unique.
It's a really great question. So the question is, how do we stop preaching to the choir, right? Like we're all kind of in agreement here. Well, there are there's a lot. We could have a whole hour just about this. I think that, the first thing I would say is that we all think we're more objective than we actually are. So what I hear, often people will say, well, I'm totally on board. Like this isn't a problem for me. How do I convince other people? And the first thing I would say is, this is, I think we actually all need to look within. Because, I spent almost 6 years writing this book, and I still find myself making snap judgments and assumptions that are incorrect about people. And I'm extremely, I am the choir. I'm the choir, and I'm the choir,
Yes.
Okay, that metaphor is breaking down. But so my point is that I think we I think before we start necessarily assuming that we've got it all figured out and it's the other people that need to change, I think we all have a lot of room in our own lives right where we're at to practice our own awareness. Practice, how am I, when I interact with a stranger or when I interact with a colleague, what are the assumptions I'm bringing to this interaction? How, am I treating this person the same way I would treat someone from a different identity group? And often the answer is no, and I think there's a lot that we can all do, even if we're already on board with the fact that this is a problem. So that's one thing. When I'm thinking about how you speak with people who are maybe skeptical of this problem or, defensive or just aren't really open to it, what I would say, there are a few different things to keep in mind. One is I think it can be extremely powerful to ask questions rather than make statements. So if you're having a conversation with someone and someone, for instance, makes a sexist remark at work or makes a racist remark, rather than saying, rather than it, I think, it can be more helpful to ask a question. What makes you say that? Why? Oh, can you tell me a little bit more about why you made that observation? Asking questions can be a way to bring someone into a conversation rather than push them away and get their defensiveness, up really strongly. And another thing I would say is all humans have these fundamental needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. We want to feel like we're free, we're autonomous. We want to feel competent, like we are capable, and we want to feel connected to other people. And so when we're having conversations with people across differences, or maybe people who have different political ideas or just different orientations towards the problem of bias and discrimination, I think if we can keep in mind those core needs, the conversations become much more productive.
Well, it seems like we should all be trained in that. Talk about training, being trained how to listen.
Yeah,
how to listen to other people. But the environment we find ourselves in right now is so fraught that this, in some ways, doesn't seem the time to be able to make much progress. I don't know. Talk about people. Getting themselves into their groups. I've never seen such, and nor have you, I'm sure, seen such a, I've used the word before, fraught populace in this country.
It's true, but at the same time, there's never been more energy and effort around questions of inclusion and diversity in workplaces. People are extremely attuned to this problem, and
young people. I want to just say, young people. You talk to people in their teens and 20s, and even into their 30s, and they don't seem quite as infected with this, and I can't figure out why. Have there been studies done showing that younger people are not as,
are not as biased? Yeah. There's some really there are some interesting studies looking at age and bias, and I'm thinking of some that look at the implicit association test, which is this measure that is kind of controversial, that purports to look to determine if people have kind of an implicit bias against certain groups. And they found that older people tend to show more bias on this test than younger people. But it's also possible that younger people also just sort of have more control, sort of impulse control or cognitive control, so that they might just be better able to answer the questions in a way where they kind of override their own stereotypes. So we don't really, so it's not entirely clear. But I think you're right. I mean, there certainly is much more acceptance of how harmful and how important these issues are, I think, among younger generations.
You know, a lot of the book is also about sexism, and you begin the book with the story of Ben Barnes, and I find it fascinating because there aren't a lot of people in the world who have had the opportunity to navigate it as a male and then to navigate it as a female or vice versa, and who can then report back how different it is to be a male or a female in how the world interacts with you. Mm-hmm. So we now have a lot of people who can tell us. So Ben, I don't know what you want to share with it about Ben Barnes, but it's not surprising to any woman what happened to him when he changed from, well, I don't know the right words, but he began his career as a female and had a very successful career in science as a neurobiologist, mm-hmm. which right away put her at in a remarkable category. But
yeah, Ben Barres' story is go ahead. His story is it's an incredible story, and I would really I would love to hear what your listeners think about it if they have a chance to take a look. Please email me, listener, if you take a look, because I'd love to hear what you think.
What's your email? What's your email address?
You can contact me through my website, which is jessicanordell.com, JESSICANORDELL.com.
Okay. Great.
That's the best way to reach out. But
thank you.
Yeah, there's a contact form on there. So yeah, I mean, he was 42 or 43 when he transitioned and became known to the world as Ben Barres. Before that, he had been presenting as a woman. And what happened was that he, as a scientist, started to be treated differently, and he found that he wasn't interrupted as much in meetings. People started to listen to him more. They took him more seriously when he spoke, when he participated, when he gave conference presentations. In fact, one scientist was overheard at a conference saying, "Ben gave a great presentation, but then again, his work is so much better than his sister's." Not knowing that Ben and this apparent, quote unquote sister were the same person. So, and the interesting thing about Ben Barres is that he, before his transition, he had not actually detected that much sexism. It wasn't until he actually became. I mean, there were cases here and there, but it wasn't really until after his transition that he retrospectively saw what had been happening, because he now had something to compare it to. He didn't realize, the ways that he'd been kind of overlooked or, not taken seriously, until suddenly everyone was taking him seriously. And he was like, oh, this is what it's like, and he told me he said after his transition, he's had the thought a million times, I am taken more seriously now. So I think, the experience of transgender people can be so illuminating because of that unique, that unique life experience of having presenting to the world in these different ways.
It suggests, though, that the people who transition the other way are in for a rude awakening if they've navigated their lives, as a male and then transition to female. That's going down. That's not going up like Ben did. You know what I mean? Do we have?
Yeah, and I mean yes, there's research about that. I mean, there's research about both groups, and it's interesting because some people, when they hear stories like Ben Barris's story or stories of transgender men who have more career success, or they think, the response can sometimes be like, oh, well, maybe they're just more confident, maybe they feel more at home in their bodies, and that's why they're experiencing these benefits. But if that were true, then trans women should have the same experience, And the fact is, trans women have the opposite experience. You hear woman after woman say, suddenly, I am now questioned more. I'm doubted more. Paula Stone Williams, who's a pastor who transitioned several years ago, said, the more you are treated like you don't know what you're doing, the more you question whether you know what you're doing. And so she, experienced some issues with confidence after transition because she found herself being questioned and doubted so much more.
Really amazing. It's you know what I wanted to get in and that I haven't had the opportunity to, and it's a little out, we've sort of passed up. I was blown away by your telling of the trailers that the movie trailers that were released by the studios who created the movie Straight Outta Compton, which is a pretty damn good movie. Straight Outta Compton. Can you tell about the two? There were two separate trailers made. One for what? It was for Facebook. One that Facebook would show to white people, and another that they would show to black people.
Yeah, this was a really, really interesting finding. It was actually, I think, the journalist Annalee Newitt who first noticed this difference. The trailers for Straight Outta Compton were different depending on what Facebook decided was your quote unquote ethnic affinity group. If you were black, if Facebook determined that you were black, you saw a trailer that started with kind of a black and white documentary about the rap group NWA, with members of NWA kind of driving around Compton, talking to the community, connecting with the community. It kind of showed the members of NWA as inspirational figures for the community that they came from. And then it transitioned to a more traditional trailer for the film. If you were white, if Facebook decided that you were white, you didn't see the documentary. You saw quick cuts that were basically, sort of your smorgasbord of stereotypes about African Americans. You saw guns, you saw violence, you saw a black man face down on the pavement in handcuffs. You saw guns. You saw drinking and drugs. I mean, it was sort of like a bingo game of black stereotypes. And the movie studio actually attributed some of the success of this movie to the powerful targeted trailers.
Wow. So the marketers knew how to appeal to black audiences, how to appeal to white prejudices, and they all bought tickets.
Mm-hmm.
But this shows the systemic nature of this problem that we have to overcome. I'm going to read some of your words back to you. You say we have not had the necessary reckoning needed to move forward, which is pretty amazing because I think to my mind, we have, but I guess as a nation as a whole, we have not. Then you say this country, among many, has not yet faced the depths of its crimes, starting with the atrocities committed against the land's first inhabitants and with slavery. It has not reckoned with the resulting injuries to its citizens or mutilation of its own moral center. This is how history becomes psychology, how the rituals of the past become the reflexes of the present. Without confronting the past, we cannot understand it, and we cannot take the actions required to repair it. And I read that because it's so true and so profound. And then I think, and now we have this growing movement to keep children from learning our past. Right?
It's interesting. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for reading that section. I mean, I was just listening to a politician speak about this who was kind of on the side of concern about, I assume you're talking about critical race theory and the debate about
yes, of course,
critical race theory. Yeah, I think this is what I meant by the fact that we haven't really had a national reckoning, because the fact that we're arguing, we're arguing about the extent to which race and racism influence the fundamental structures of our country means that we haven't come to a consensus in this country, and we need to have that reckoning so that we can teach and move beyond, the harmful parts of our past that are still with us every day.
Oh boy, I wish, Jessica, that I had your capacity to be hopeful. I don't. I'm sorry. And your book is amazing. It's just amazing. I want to again tell the audience the book is The End of Bias. Books now have so many subtitles and subtitles of subtitles that now to give the name of a book, it takes 5 hours. But I'll give you The End of Bias, A Beginning. The Science and Practice of Overcoming Unconscious Bias. The author, again, Jessica Nordell, jessicanordell.com, if you want to get a little, get a bit closer. And I want to thank you so much. Really do. It was wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me, Lynn. This was such a pleasure, and I'm thrilled to get to share some of these ideas with your listeners. It's really been a joy to talk to you.
Well, you have done. I mean, as you said, it took you 6 years to write this, and you're a wonderful writer. We need better science writers, people who can, just translate the science to someone like me, who is not by nature scientifically literate. So I really appreciate it, and I wish you continued success. The book, by the way, is out. Is it Metropolitan Books or Holt? HenryHolt.com.
Yes.
Holt. Okay. Fantastic. Jessica, a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye-bye. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And for the rest of you, I hope you found that as interesting as I did. I assumed you would. And wow. All right. Well, it's a Thursday, so I ain't going to talk to you again till Monday. And God knows what's going to happen between now and then. Hey, listen, keep your heads down. Keep your faces masked. Keep your hearts open. And cross your fingers. Love you. See ya.
Lynn Cullen Live. Monday through Thursday from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. and archived at pghcitypaper.com. The opinions expressed on Lynn Cullen Live are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the viewpoints of Pittsburgh City Paper or its advertisers.